Today I'd like to tell you about a new line of research that I've been working on with my collaborators, Justin Friesen and Caitlin Neufeld. You may have met her. She was giving out programs this morning at the table there. Okay, and so for a while now, I've really been interested in understanding the antecedents and consequences of system justification. So this motivated tendency people have to defend and bolster their social systems. And typically we've been studying system justification, how it operates in contexts that are relevant to social inequality, such as gender and socioeconomic status. But last year, thanks to support from the Pathways to Prosperity Immigration Partnership, we've started to investigate whether and how system justification plays a role in the public's attitudes towards refugees and immigrants, and immigration more generally. So since June 2015, what we've done is we've started tracking Canadians' attitudes. And so today I'm just going to share with you our initial insights, okay, with a focus on the role that system justification plays in affecting people's attitudes. And so, of course, you know, given how early we are in the process, we greatly appreciate any feedback you might have for future studies here. So first, let me set the context just a little bit. Many of you may already know this, but typically, at least relative to other countries, Canada is known for being a relatively immigrant-friendly country. Okay, so these are just data that I pulled from the 2005-2009 grouping of the World Values Survey. And here, respondents were given a list of various groups of people, and they were asked to mention any that they would not like to have as neighbors, okay? So respondents, you can see here, this is just, I just plotted the percentage of respondents who said they would not want immigrants or foreign workers, or people who speak a different language as neighbors. So higher scores here, more negative attitudes, right? So you can see that respondents from places like Canada, Norway, and Sweden were among the least likely to mention these type of groups. In contrast, right, you see almost 37% of respondents from France, 16% from Finland, 14% from the UK say they would not want immigrants or foreign workers as neighbors. And you know, data from the Immigrant Integration Policy Index paints a very similar picture that Canada is a relatively immigrant-friendly country. So out of the 38 countries that they indexed in 2014, Canada received a score of 6 out of 38, with relatively high scores for labor market mobility and anti-discrimination policy. Sweden there, you can see, has a score of 1 out of 38. France and the UK with scores of 17 and 15, okay? Right, but despite being known as a relatively immigrant-friendly country, there is variability in attitudes and behaviors towards refugees in Canada. So newcomers in Canada still face stereotyping and discrimination, right? These are just some headlines that I pulled from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And we know historically that there are examples of discriminatory measures taken by immigration officials in Canada. So for example, in 1923, there was the prohibition of all Chinese immigrants. In 1939, the ship, the St. Louis, which was carrying over 900 Jewish refugees, was not allowed to land in Canada and forced to return to Europe, ultimately sentencing 3/4 of those passengers to death. So those are just a few examples. And today we know from Vicki and her colleagues' work that even though majority of newcomers, some 60% are accepted into Canada each year based on their skills, many still face unemployment and underemployment. Specifically because their skills, once they're here, are often not perceived as meeting Canadian standards. So like many of you in this room, right, we were interested in understanding why attitudes vary in favorability. What are those underlying psychological variables that are affecting people's attitudes? And for sure, there's a lot of important work demonstrating perceptions of threat, right, in-group biases and dehumanization of refugees and immigrants. leading to negative attitudes. But what we were really interested in focusing on is the role that system justification plays in affecting people's attitudes towards refugees. And so system justification theory proposes that people, to varying degrees of course, have this psychological motivation to see their existing socio-political systems as legitimate. Okay? So just as people have, or are motivated rather, to feel good about themselves and the groups that they belong to, according to system justification theory, people also have this are motivated to see their socio-political systems in the same kind of positive light, right? So often system justification is assessed using the Kay and Joe system justification scale. So I put an item up here, right? In general, the Canadian political system operates as it should. And so high system justifiers, people who would strongly agree with this, these are people who are especially motivated to see their socio-political systems as fair and legitimate. And so these are the people who justify the system, report that they are content with it, and are resistant to changing it. And so we reasoned that if immigration is perceived by some Canadians as a potential threat to the status quo, because newcomers' cultural values and traditions can provoke, social, political, and economic change, then there may be a conflict between the necessity of immigration for Canadian economic success, humanitarian goals, and global security, and the psychological motive that creates the resistance to change. And so if this were the case, then we may expect that system justification would be negatively associated with attitudes towards refugees and immigrants, right? So the more that people justify the system, the less favorable those attitudes are. But we also know from past research that given that people are motivated to justify their socio-political systems, to the extent that they perceive something to be system sanctioned, they do and they should become more favorable towards it. Right? So by system sanctioned, I just mean tied to the core values of the Canadian socio-political system and part of the established status quo, right? So in this way, if the system is officially supportive of refugees and immigrants, we may actually see positive associations between people's motivation to justify their socio-political system and attitudes towards refugees and immigrants, a kind of system-sanctioned pro-immigrant attitude. And so we used here, we used system justification theory as a framework for understanding Canadians' attitudes. And specifically what we thought is, in line with this system-sanctioned attitude change hypothesis, we thought that in the early days of Syrian refugee settlement in Canada, we may expect less positive attitudes. However, to the extent that Syrian refugee settlement is officially supported by the government and positively portrayed in mass media, so to the extent it becomes system sanctioned, we should see attitudes becoming more favorable. Right. And so, so far we have 3 waves of cross-sectional national survey data. And these data were collected in June 2015, so this is 4 months before a federal election in Canada, January 2016, 3 months after the election, and June 2016, 8 months after the election. Right? And so what this allowed us to do is test how Canadians' attitudes had changed at a time when there was an official shift in people's attitudes. Right? So our Wave 1 data was collected June 2015, and this is when the Harper Conservative government was in power. And I had trouble with this wording. I think it's fair to say that the official government stance on refugees and immigrants at this time was not uniformly positive, right? So in 2014, the Conservative Government of Canada proposed the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act as an amendment to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It was designed to prevent polygamy, forced marriage, honor killings among new arrivals. And so irrespective of its intentions, right, the use of this kind of dehumanizing language in the title of the act likely had negative consequences for attitudes. Later on, the Conservative government had promised that they would set up a tip line through the RCMP so that people could call in on their neighbors. We didn't elect them. No, right. They also made some changes so that anyone coming into the country and labeled a so-called irregular arrival no longer was permitted to access Canadian health care while they were awaiting their immigration status. That had previously been customary. When some provinces stepped in to cover the medical costs, the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration at the time had suggested that it was irresponsible of the provinces to do this because it made Canada and Ontario in particular a magnet for bogus asylum seekers. The Conservative government was also known for their fight against the niqab, which began in 2011, where there was a directive sent down by the ministry saying that women had to show their faces during oath during citizenship ceremonies. Okay, so this was all happening and all part of the national discourse at Wave 1 when we first collected our data. Okay, but Waves 2 and 3 were collected when there was this fundamental and striking shift in the system's official stance on refugees and immigration, becoming much more positive. So as part of his campaign, Trudeau, who was the leader of the Liberal Party, promised to bring 25,000 Syrian refugees to Canada by the end of 2015. Following his election, it was the target was extended to the end of February 2016, and I believe currently we're sitting at numbers just under 35,000. So much of the activity to get people here was described publicly in an ongoing basis, and the language used to describe the activity was uniformly positive, right? So you can see here, this is taken from the Government of Canada website, the banner "Open Hearts and Welcoming Communities." It's the Canadian way. I mean, you can't get more system sanctioning than that wording. Right? And in tweeting about the arrivals of the first plane load of Syrian refugees in December, the Prime Minister Trudeau used the hashtag #WelcomeRefugees and publicly greeted refugees at the airports, saying with statements, "You're safe now." In newspapers, it read things like "Welcome home" in both English and in Arabic. Okay, so this is when Wave 2 and 3 of the data was collected. So we had really stumbled upon this perfect opportunity, right, to test how attitudes had shifted here. And so in total, we have over 1,000 respondents from all over Canada. Oh, I have to point out Winnipeg. There we are, somewhere right around there. Okay. And our sample was representative of the population in terms of gender, age, and region. But importantly, this sample was representative of the broader Canadian population within each wave of the data that we collected, so that's very important. And in terms of measures, we had a lot of measures in there, but perhaps most relevant to this discussion is what we used as our positivity index. So here we had asked Canadians to report their perception of each of the different migrant classification used by the government, but also reported in newspapers. So the extent to which people saw refugees, for example, as warm, friendly, good-natured, sincere, but also competent, capable, confident, and skillful, right? What we also had, though, in here was our system justification measure, right? This is the extent to which people were motivated to justify the system. And so we could test and look to see whether some migrant groups are perceived more positively than others, whether it differs by region across Canada, and whether Canadians' attitudes became more positive over time, and whether there's evidence for this kind of system sanctioning effect that I was alluding to earlier. So across all the waves of data, okay, this is not broken down by wave, people reported the highest positivity for economic class immigrants, followed by temporary foreign workers, refugees, and then undocumented. Okay? And so the red line here, that's just the midpoint of the scale. And so people always ask me, are these attitudes positive? I guess it's in the eye of the beholder, right? Whether these are positive attitudes or not. But this general pattern held true across Canada, with the exception of Quebec, where temporary foreign workers, well, let me go back there, where temporary foreign workers were seen significantly more positively. Otherwise, that positivity pattern held across the country. Okay, but maybe more interestingly, did Canadians' attitudes become more positive over time? Okay, so here I've just plotted the positivity scores. Those are the warmth and competence dimensions, right, of all those migrant groups, refugee, economic, temporary foreign worker, and illegals, or undocumented. And what you can see, so remember, wave one, the black bars here, this is during the time of the Harper Conservative government, right? And then we have our wave two and wave three data. And what you see is that there was a main effective wave, right? So regardless of the migrant class, people's attitudes towards migrants became more positive over the shift in government. And this increase in positivity was maintained at wave three. So often there's no differences between wave two and wave three, right? It's just this big jump from wave one to wave two. Okay. But perhaps more germane, right, to the hypothesis that increases in positivity are due to the official system sanctioning of refugees. Here, what we did is we plotted system justification and that motivation to justify the system along the bottom here. And so we found that the relationship between system justification and refugee positivity became stronger over time, right? So at wave one, there's this modest correlation. It gets stronger at wave two and strongest at wave three. And so, you know, the zero-order correlations here between system justification and refugee positivity, they reflect that pattern that's consistent with the system sanctioning hypothesis, right? And so what we also did is we explored, this is a significant overall interaction, right? So we explored this further by looking at among these high system justifiers, these people here, there was this significant linear trend, right? So among high system justifiers, those motivated to justify, over time, they became more pro-refugee. We don't see that pattern among low system justifiers down here. And we also looked to see whether or not this was true of both liberals and conservatives, right? And so, of course, there was that expected main effect of political orientation, right? Conservatives reported less positivity than did liberals. But the self-identified conservatives reported just as much positivity towards refugees as their liberal counterparts, if only if they were also motivated to justify the system. Right? And so you may be wondering, are these really conservatives who are justifying the liberal government stance? Could this be possible? And we think so. Okay, we think it is possible. Our sample was a little bit skewed when we looked at the distribution for political orientation. So, reflective of the Canadian population, we had more liberals than conservatives in our sample, but we still had 32% of the sample using the conservative side of the scale, right? So they existed in our sample. All right. So what else did we have in this survey? Well, we had other additional attitude measures that we thought would be important predictors of attitudes towards refugees and immigrants. So we had included social dominance orientation and perceived threat, right? So what extent do you think that resources go to refugees or whatever migrant classification they were answering about? To what extent would that take resources away from the rest of society? Right? And so we just ran a regression analysis. Now this is just showing the associations across all of the waves, right? We can see in line with past research, perceived threat and social dominance orientation, those are important predictors, right? More threat, higher on social dominance orientation, less refugee positivity. But entering system justification still added something to the model, right? And indeed, this our change statistic was significant when we added in system justification here. So we saw in that data, right, with the official change in government and its more supportive stance on immigration and refugees, we saw attitudes become more favorable from wave 1 to waves 2 and 3. Also, to the extent that people were justifying the system, they reported greater positivity over time, mirroring the positive, more positive government stance. And of course, this isn't experimental data, right? Causality is always an issue here. But I should mention that system justification scores did not significantly increase across the waves, okay? Only increases in positivity from waves 1 to waves 2 and 3. But nonetheless, we're currently running, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about, you know, potential mediators and things that we should add into these experiments. We're running studies where we're going to systematically manipulate the message so that it's more or less system sanctioning, and cross that with a system justification motivation manipulation rather than just measurement. Right? So currently working on that. Something else that we're really interested in doing is trying to think more deeply about our attitudes measure. So we, in this national survey data, we used warmth and competence. And some of you may recognize that as coming from the stereotype content model. And so I think it's a good measure, but we also want to see whether or not we should be paying attention to not just positivity in terms of warmth and competence, but also support for various forms of acculturation. So are Canadians supporting assimilation versus integration, for example? And so we've got some other data that we collected in Winnipeg where we found really high levels of support for immigrant-serving agencies. These are agencies that are designed to help facilitate the integration of refugees and immigrants into Canada. And whenever we presented this data, people always said, are Winnipeggers really that supportive, or are they assuming that these immigrant-serving agencies are simply tasked with assimilation rather than integration? And so something we're doing now is trying to reframe our dependent measures to tease apart whether it's really whether support for immigrant-serving agencies is support for agencies that are designed or tasked with assimilation versus integration, right? With the central piece being, in the integration frame, being that the immigrant-serving agencies are also trying to help immigrants maintain some of their original cultural identities. Ooh, and we had some data that I had to add in here at the 9th hour last night. So what we did here is we manipulated the framing of immigrant centers, and we stated whether the goal was assimilation or integration, but we also crossed that with a threat manipulation. And what we found is that in general, Canadians were more supportive of immigrant-serving centers when they were framed in terms of supporting integration rather than assimilation. But we see that support for immigrant-serving agencies aimed at assimilation, there's this marginal increase after a terror or a threat salience passage. Oh, see, I can see my cursor here. You can't. I need a pointer. In terms of integration, right, we see this opposite effect. Okay, but back to system justification and Canadians' attitudes. I think that the role of system justification and attitudes towards refugees and immigrants is complex, right? Attitudes are going to depend, at least in part, on both people's motivation to justify the existing system, but also, and importantly, on the content of the system. I think another important point is that system justification, I think, is understudied in its relation to immigration and refugees. Right? There's a lot of work on SDO, in-group biases, threat, dehumanization. But I think that system justification theory can add something to our understanding of attitudes. We can talk about those after. Okay, so thank you.